Well, we're now at stage 3, which is the desensitization and integration phase of treatment. And as I said previously, what we've done at the end of stage 2 is we've hopefully re-administered the PCL or the TRS, one of those, and we are talking with our clients about how are their flashbacks and nightmares doing. If the flashbacks and nightmares are no longer occurring, then there's no reason for us to ever do any trauma memory uncovering. However, trauma is not the only thing that we're doing. And if there is, then we may be moving towards resolving trauma. And I'll get to that later. There's 2 things that we're doing in stage 3 that we are seeking desensitization and integration with. And one of them is trauma and one of them is grief. Frequently, what happens is that they're commingled. And when you do successful resolution of integration and desensitization of the trauma memory, then the grief just comes forward naturally, that it follows. And matter of fact, when you're doing trauma therapy and you have a client that starts being tearful, that's really good news. That's evidence that you've been successful in desensitizing the trauma, because the grief, the loss that's associated with that will not come forward while the person is still terrified. It stays impacted and suppressed. But also, there is some clients that we work with that the flashbacks are no longer occurring. They're no longer having nightmares. They're no longer meeting criterion B for PTSD, but there's a lot of grief, that there's a lot of sadness, that much of the losses of their life, as they're practicing self-regulation, what they're finding is that they're having these bouts of tearfulness. And so what I want to do is to do 2 15-minute little capsules here on how to work with grief, how to get desensitized and integrated common, uncomplicated bereavement, recent loss bereavement and grief that has happened over the past year, and then walk you into how to do some elegant work with folks that have complicated bereavement before we go into the trauma and trauma work. So that just remember here now where we are. This is all that we've done so far, is that we have done assessment and treatment planning. We have talked through and developed skills for positive expectancy and hope building, that you are now practicing with your client feedback informed therapy and starting to have really good outcomes as a result of that, building a better and better therapeutic relationship. We've transitioned into stage 2. We have helped to do the psychoeducational part of where we've helped our clients to see that they are over-adapted rather than afflicted. They are they've developed skills for, and they're coming back and reporting successfully of confronting the perceived threats of their lives in a relaxed muscle body, and they're starting to report better quality of life as a result of that. And we have taught them some intermediate skills. So we're now in stage 3 and helping them to integrate and desensitize trauma and loss and grief. So what's the treatment for grief? I ask that question every time I do a presentation when I do this. And you can see, because by this time, after halfway through the second day, the participants in the workshop have learned that I'm a little bit of a provocateur, and they're little gun shy and reticent about answering anymore because I've set them up so many times. And I always say something like, well, for those of you, you probably smell the trap. And it was a device, a mechanism, because there is no treatment for grief. It's not a pathological condition and therefore requires no treatment. And while that's simple and straightforward, it's a really big deal. There is no treatment for grief. It does not require treatment. If you've got a client who is coming in to see you in the first year after a loss, they're coming in because they're in pain. And frequently they're looking for a way around the pain. And you taking that bait and begin to start to treat them is sneaking up on malpractice. Because nothing is wrong. And I'm standing on the shoulders of J. William Worden right now. If you've not read Worden and you work with people who have had, with people that are grieving and have had loss, then you need to get Worden's book. It's really pretty much the Bible of this. He is the greatest living expert on grief and loss, with maybe the possible exception of Therese Rando and Rachel Raymond. But he's been writing this book, Grief Counseling and Grief Therapy, 4th edition in 2009, I think was when he published that, the 4th edition. He's been writing it for 30 years, and reading that book's like watching Michael Jordan play basketball or like watching Paul Newman act. It's somebody that's spent a life of really getting it right. And what he says in his book in Grief Counseling and Grief Therapy is he says, you know, in the first year after a significant loss, whatever my client is doing, as long as they're not causing harm to themselves or others, it is my job, our job, to support that. Not treat it, support it. We assume, not even normalcy, we assume this is optimal for them. This is the way that they're supposed to do it. And when a therapist gets anxious and is not self-regulating, what we start doing is that we start regressing to trying to treat what's not broken. And I think that's a really important place to start. For those of you who have, and so Worden, what Worden's advocating and saying that is our responsibility in the first year after a loss is that we support them through that process. And when you think about supportive therapy, what is it that you do when you do supportive therapy? What are the active ingredients of supportive therapy? And when I ask that question in a training, the most ready answer that I get is listening. And I say, absolutely, that is what we're doing, is that we're doing a whole lot more listening and a whole lot less talking. Worden talks about, he says that in the first year after a loss, what we want to create is an active client and a passive therapist. And how do you get an active client and a passive therapist? Well, you got to shut the hell up. And there's no population with whom you will ever work that it is more important for you to not bridge every single silence on early treatment with somebody that has had a recent loss with a question. So right action with somebody that has had a recent loss who's coming to see you in therapy is that at least every other silence, your intervention needs to be this: warm countenance and nodding. If I'm asking a question to my client, every time there's a silence and it becomes uncomfortable, and I feel that discomfort, instead of regulating, I ask a question, and ask a question, and ask a question. What dynamics do I have by the 3rd or 4th session? I have the opposite of what I want. I've got an active therapist and a passive client. It's 180-degree opposite of what is indicated. We want it the other way. And the only way to get an active client who is engaged, and what we're seeking to have happen here is to have our client externalize. Instead of retroflecting, the language that Pearls and Goldman used, is instead of chewing their cud and ruminating, that what we want them to do is to bring forward and share those internal processes. That's what is the most important function that we can do, is hearing them externalize what's going on inside of them. And to be able to get that, we got to shut up and do a lot of this, warm countenance and nod. And when you look at somebody with a warm countenance and you nod at them, they talk. And they'll talk a little bit and they'll look at you expectantly. And as you keep nodding, they'll talk more. So that then, doing that more and more frequently, by the third or fourth session, your client comes in, sits down, and talks the whole session, which is exactly what you want. So that's a really important piece of supportive therapy, is shutting up more than talking. What else goes into supportive therapy? Well, psychoeducation, specifically in the form of normalization and validation. And what types of things do we say to help our client, to help normalize and validate our clients? Well, the same thing that we say to the people that we care about and we love. This is hard, and I don't understand what you're going through. Would you please teach me what that's like for you? And I can only imagine that this is really difficult. And it seems like that when I've walked through loss in my past, that it's been messy, and I don't know any other way to do that. I mean, those are relationally connecting things to say, and that are normalizing and validating. One of the things that I want to do is, you saw a little bit of this when I was talking about the postmodern stuff. One of the things that postmodern work tries to do is not normalize, but take it all the way to optimization, to not teach people that they're normal, but really that they're optimal. And so, kind of one of the ways to do that is that if you have, if there is a moment for lightening with your client, then you can say something like, if we were to Google healthy bereavement, your picture would be there. I wish I could show my other clients the way that you're handling this, because this is exactly the way that it's supposed to be done. And what do you suppose happens when a professional tells a person who's grieving that this is exactly the way it's supposed to be done? It helps them to settle into their process, to relax into it, which is exactly the most accelerated way for them to get to the other side. And speaking of the other side, a lot of clients, especially in early loss, they're coming to therapy, even though some aren't even conscious of it. They're looking for a way to get through this without pain. And it doesn't exist. And so it's really important that I lay that out early on. And so there's the warm fuzzy part of validation and normalization and psychoeducation, which I just did with you, but there's also an equally important cold prickly part that I do when I'm working with somebody that's had a recent loss, and that is in some way teaching them that there's nothing for it. I wish that there was some way that I could take this away from you, that you didn't have to have this pain. But, and I love this quote up there on the slide, that's why I left it up there, is this has been really helpful for me. It's a quote from Rachel Raymond that Warden quotes in his book, and it says, do you want to remember with love instead of pain? If the answer to that is yes, what do you already know in your heart of hearts is the way that, what do you got to do to get there? And our clients know that at some level. And I want to underscore it. Yeah, the way to get to remembering love instead of pain is to walk it through to the other side. And I don't know how to take any of that away from you. What I got for you here, and what I'm happy to bring, is that you don't have to do this alone. I'd be honored to walk through this work with you. That's what I can do. The other little bit cold, prickly part that I need to do, and Warden talks about this a lot in his book, is that a lot of my clients come in who have had recent losses, that they will talk about where they are in the stages of grief. And I always scratch my head and I go, stages of grief? Huh, I've never heard about the stages of grief. And they say, well, that's what they are, isn't it? Isn't it anger and acceptance? I mean, anger and bargaining and denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance? And I go, oh, no. Those are Kubler-Ross's stages for dying. They're not for grief. Matter of fact, Kubler-Ross was really antagonistic about people trying to use them for grief, is they have no fitting to grief. There are no stages for grief. And when people start believing that there's a stage model for grief, what they always believe is that they need to be somewhere other than where they are. There is only one right way to do this, and that's your way. Your way is the way through this. There's not an external process that people follow. It's you walk it through, and it's messy, and it's painful, but you're going to get to the other side. And so those are the types of psychoeducational components that I need to do. And there are a few more, and let me just kind of zip through these, that I'll stop doing the Socratic question and just bring them forward. That therapeutic relationship is probably the most potent ingredient in supportive therapy. And I'm wondering if you guys have any idea about how you could build, maintain, and enhance a therapeutic relationship with somebody that has had a recent loss, and how you could be absolutely certain that you were building that relationship. Feedback-informed therapy. I can't think of anybody that deserves to have a Goldilocks therapeutic relationship. A clinician, a therapist that is continually trying to find the best way to deliver therapy to them, than somebody that is suffering through a loss. Is that absolutely I want to make sure that I'm doing feedback-informed therapy with somebody that has had a loss in the past year. And then also associated with supportive therapy is that we do case management. And with grieving, there's two types of case management that are really important. And the first is an assessment. We're looking at them through the lens of Maslow's pyramid. And if they're in Maslow's basement, if they are not safe, if they don't have food, clothing, and shelter, if they have zero support, then it's incumbent upon us to begin to move into case management and resource development so they can get those needs met. And once we're sure that they're not in Maslow's basement, then the second case management function that we perform with people that have had recent losses is we are the hub that connects our clients with community services. And we want to make sure that we are helping our clients avail themselves to all the support networks that are out there for recent losses, and especially there's no group that this is more important to than parents that have lost children. Is that psychotherapy is pretty impotent when working with parents that have lost children, unless they are also in a group process of where they're seeing people that are doing worse than them and people that are doing better than them, and that helps them to normalize and settle into their process. So that's the case management piece. And then finally, I hope that I've made a really good case for why self-regulation would be a really important component of supportive therapy. Because while it is therapeutic, it's not therapy. It is really adult development. It's teaching your clients how to maximize their quality of life. And it's something that I want to do with the big reason, as I'm about to show you here in a little bit, the big reason why grief perseverates and continues to cause suffering in the life of somebody that has lost, whether that's a person or an object or an idea, is because that they are constantly perceiving threat every time that they think about that loss, and they are they have autonomic nervous system dysregulation, and helping them to regulate accelerates their way through to the other side. So this is what the first year looks like: is we listen, we build therapeutic relationships, we educate them, we encourage them, we validate and normalize what they're going through, we connect them with resources, and then we teach and coach them in self-regulation. That's what normal bereavement looks like.